Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Well, Drew, thank you so much for being here. As I mentioned to you before, I'm a huge fan and really, really excited that you're taking the time. I wanted to get in somewhat of an unexpected topic because typically we're focused on wildlife, but I saw that you're an avid paraglider, and I've always been fascinated as to what the experience of paragliding is like. So if you can talk a little bit about how you got involved in paragliding and what that's like,
Sure.
I'd love to know.
Sure. Well, I kind of got into it because, when I was a kid, I would look at National Geographic and I would see pictures of George Steinmetz flying, the pictures that he was taking, flying his paraglider around Africa. And I lived in Africa for a little while when I was a teenager. And so it was just always kind of what I wanted to do. And I ended up living in Jackson, Wyoming, which is kind of like a mecca for paragliding in North America. It's a fantastic place to do it. I ended up living there for a long time, and I just put it together. I took a class and finally just said, the heck with it, I'm going to do it.
That's awesome. So,
Yeah.
So do you have your own paragliding equipment? Like, do you go out often?
Yeah, for sure. And, for me, for me, flying a paraglider is something that I like to do to kind of further my passion about being outdoors. You know what I mean? I can fly a paraglider and be okay with flying a paraglider. If I'm going to fly my paramotor, which is the unit that, has the big engine on your back and you can kind of take off from a flat ground or, you don't have to be up in the mountains. If I'm going to fly that, I like to focus more on photography and, making things work photographically with that. Because you can kind of look at something in the distance and say, I'm going to go take pictures of that formation over there, that canyon over there, and fly there easily. Whereas you would have to have, years of skill being built up as a paraglider pilot. And I like trying to pursue that aspect of it also, but without a camera.
So what is that process like? You grab your stuff and you hike up to a huge outcropping and then you just send it off?
Essentially, I mean, the two types, paragliding, you need slope and some altitude essentially to get going. And in the evening, you can do what they call ridge soaring. So if the wind is in your face and you're standing at the top of a mountain or a ridge or whatever, that wind is going to be coming up slope, generating lift, and you can just soar back and forth on that lift all night long. It's absolutely phenomenal. Or you can fly cross country. So you take off earlier in the day, and then you try and thermal up and, cross country, send it across, mountain ranges or what. And there are guys out there that are just absolutely just will blow your mind with what they're doing, flying these things around. God. I think the North American distance record is like 188 miles without a motor. I think they were flying for like 7 hours or something like that.
Wow.
I mean, it's incredible. But again, those guys are, top athletes. I mean, it's something that takes a lot of skill and practice. And so I appreciate trying to learn that. But when I want to go out and take pictures of something, I kind of cheat and I'll throw the motor on and I can take off from flat ground, the size of about a basketball court. And like I said, pick a spot, go fly there, take some pictures, and then come home.
Do you ever reach like a peaceful point, or is it always kind of a scary type of scenario?
No, it's very low impact. I mean, it's you're flying at about 17-ish miles an hour, so it's not very fast. It's not very fast. You're sitting in a very comfortable, relaxed position. George, I think, would refer to it as a flying lawn chair. So you're, you know what I mean. So you're kind of like sitting in a comfortable chair, and you're just cruising around. To be honest with you, when I fly the motor, I get kind of bored because I want to get to my destination and shoot it and, look at it.
Right.
But flying a paraglider, you're in more active air. You're flying at a different time of day. So there's thermals and lift and things like that.
Is it a lot of regulation as to where you can fly or not? Or it's pretty open?
Yes and no. Once you take off, you're dealing with federal airspace regulations.
Right.
But in terms of learning to fly these, you don't have the same kind of structure that you do, say, learning to fly a fixed wing aircraft. And I always wanted to learn how to fly a plane. Mm-hmm. And so eventually I just realized that financially that wasn't going to do it for me.
Yeah.
And so I needed to do something else. And I kept thinking about George. And so I looked into it, and you don't need a license. And, for about the same cost of paying for your private fixed wing license,
right,
you can learn how to paraglide and buy a wing and a harness and be ready to go. So
is there like a dual person harness for when you're learning, or do you just kind of have to?
No. Well, when you learn on the ground. So, they teach you to pull it up in the air and then set it back down, and that's like your first introduction to the wing is pull it up, set it down, pull it up, set it down. You do that over and over and over. And then eventually you're pulling it up backwards, and eventually you pull it up and they'll tell you to turn around, and you turn around, you're facing forward, and you're just on the ground kiting it with it above your head.
Got it.
And then you turn around, you put it back down on the ground. So you learn all of the handling stuff on the ground. And, the flying is very easy. If you're flying around and you look to the right and lean to the right, you'll turn the glider to the right. Same thing to the left. If you look and lean to the left, you can turn it to the left. So you can fly it with no hands.
Oh my God.
And you can take pictures at the same time. But the launching and the landing is mandatory. So that's
right.
Finesse comes in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Of handling the wing and stuff like that.
Wow.
But the wing is designed to recover. Say a beginner wing is designed to recover from any kind of abnormality, like a collapse or something like that, without any input from the pilot. But what you need is elevation. And so it's actually more dangerous flying closer to the ground, because if your wing collapses or something happens, you don't have any elevation for the wing to recover.
Got it. Oh, that makes sense.
So my first two flights, to get back to your question, my first two flights were at the training hill in Curtis Canyon, where I was just kind of skimming off the ground. And then my third flight was from the top of the gondola at Jackson Hole Mountain Resort, like, 3,000 feet or whatever it was. And, that's a little overwhelming at first, but I'm terrified of heights. Like, I can't go up to the edge of a cliff and stand on the edge of a cliff and feel comfortable. But if I'm sitting in my paraglider harness flying around, I'm fine.
I don't know if that qualifies for being scared of heights.
Well, I mean, we were just down in the desert Southwest with my daughter, looking at some of these canyons and all of this stuff. And I mean, anytime that she was even close to the edge, it made my stomach churn just seeing her close to the edge, but flying around in the paraglider, nothing.
And does she come in with you ever?
No, she's a little young still, but she wants to fly. She runs around with her hands over her head going, yeah.
How old is she?
4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated, because to me, just not understanding the science or the mechanics of it, I've always been like, it looks like you're just kind of jumping off of a cliff with like a parachute. It just always seemed very scared to me as someone who I even get stressed out flying. Not that I don't fly, but I've never been comfortable in heights.
I hear you. I tell you, it makes everything else that you've ever done look silly. I mean, like, I want to go flying now. Like, I don't want to go skiing. I don't want to do anything like that. Like, if I have time off, or if I have like an idea for something, it involves trying to figure out how to incorporate flying, because it is amazing. It is really fun. There's nothing in front of you. You know what I mean? People say it's the closest that you can get to actually feeling like a bird, because, there's no cockpit in front of you, and you're just, in the elements. It's fantastic.
It sounds very meditative.
Oh, that's great.
Do you ever get any encounters with birds while you're up there?
I have not. I mean, I'll see birds flying and things like that. And, I try not to fly too close to anything like that. I don't want to necessarily harass that type of stuff. Paraglider pilots, when they're soaring, they'll soar in the same thermals as, hawks and eagles and stuff like that. And you can look it up on YouTube and see, tons of videos of people flying with hawks and thermals and stuff.
That's dope.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well, and if you're out in the LA area, look around out there and see if there's some spots that you could go. I think down by Santa Barbara might be the closest. Santa Barbara might be the closest place that I can think of that's like consistently good, where you could go take a tandem flight and see if you'd like it.
Yeah, I think I might have to work up the courage for that one, but it's something I definitely want to try out because I don't know. I think a lot of those things seem so scary before you get into it. And then once you're there, you're like, I couldn't imagine living where I wasn't doing this on a weekend or a monthly basis.
Exactly.
But I was checking out your Instagram earlier today and was seeing, looks like a lot of your recent time has been spent with wolves. Is that a project you're working on right now?
Yes, I'm packing up to head up there right now. Last year started the first kind of field time working with the National Park Service in a place called Yukon Charlie Rivers National Preserve.
Okay.
And they have a lot of the wolves that if you read or hear about aerial gunning of wolves up there, wolf control, predator management type of stuff, a lot of that is happening with the wolves in the Yukon Charlie area. And it's a really remote place. It's really hard to get to. So there's not a lot of coverage of the animals themselves, like in the wild. There's no roads in the park or anything like that. So the Park Service asked me to come up there and see if we could kind of put a face with a name. And so last year was the first year that we went out, spent 3 weeks in June watching a wolf den and trying to get pictures of these guys.
Wow. So there's zero roads. So how are you getting in? You're flying in and just kind of trekking into the area?
That's right. We flew in by helicopter. We flew in, shuttled some gear in on a plane and then flew in on a helicopter.
So when you're going up this week, what does that work entail? Like, what are you getting into?
We're going to go set up camp. We're about a mile away from a den site that we know that they used last year. And so this year we're going in with about 14 remote cameras. And we're going to be setting those remote cameras up in the places that we watched them use last year. Okay. On the landscape. So we're in a kind of a valley looking across a small river. And it's almost a mile across from our camp to the wolf den. And it's almost at the same elevation. And then it drops down fairly steeply to the river. And so last year, pretty much the whole time, I mean, it was like watching this nature show in front of you, because we'd sit there with binos and a spotting scope and watch the den. And then we'd see the wolves leave and we would try and move from camp to try and intercept them on their path of wherever they were going off hunting to get photos and video and things like that. And so now that we know those paths and know where they're traveling, we're going to go in with remote cameras to try and get a little bit more intimate footage.
Is the population pretty healthy over there?
It's doing pretty good. The thing that they're contending with is this wolf management, predator control type of stuff. And so they're just trying to kind of highlight that the wolves are coming into the preserve to give birth to their pups, raise the pups, and then in the wintertime when they start traveling, going outside of the preserve, that's when they run into predator control problems with the state and things like that.
So it's the fact that within the park, they can't actually cull the populations, correct?
That's right.
It's after
That's
this
right.
whole birthing season?
That's right. So this is kind of like their sanctuary. They're coming into the park to give birth. Last year, I think we saw them come out of the den the first time with like 8 or 9 pups. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was pretty cool to see.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What's the problem once they leave their sanctuary? Or the national park? Is it largely game hunting, or is it running into livestock? Or
no, it's dealing with caribou population and trying to work around caribou herd management and things like that. So it's not necessarily just one with a lot of this wildlife stuff, I think people would like to simplify it down to kind of one thing that they need to try and understand or fix with it. But it really kind of cascades, you know what I mean? When you deal with one animal, like a wolf, how does it affect the caribou population outside of the park? How are they trying to manage the caribou population outside the park through predator control or hunting or you name it? It just kind of cascades into all of these other things.
Oh,
if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think it falls into this problem that we always have, which is once humans have been involved in some capacity, every time you're trying to balance the levers, it's almost impossible to find that natural balance. Is there a clear direction that they're trying to move forward in? Does it require a lot more studying? Like, is the caribou population struggling, or is that largely that they just want the numbers higher for hunters?
Well, I think that depends on who you talk to.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I think, I think if a lot of times, say down here in Wyoming, for example, you have a lot of people in the hunting community that just hate wolves, you know what I mean? And they'll blame them for elk population rises or declines or, whatever it may be, when that may not well be the case. It's a tough one. That's a tough one to answer because, you hear things about, that's a very, it's a hard one to answer, man.
It was even a hard question for me to form.
Yeah.
I guess my question is if the National Park Service is putting together this campaign to try and get folks to empathize with the wolves, is it their understanding that they believe that the wolf populations need to be culled less? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I am not sure. I would hesitate to say less or more. I mean, I would say the researchers that I work with up there, I know for a fact researchers that I've worked with down here in Wyoming, when it comes to the idea of predator control, predator hunting, most of those guys aren't necessarily totally against it.
Right.
And I think a lot of times people think that they are, that the researchers doing this stuff are saying that this should not be happening at all. I think that they just want to educate the public about what's going on up there. Because a lot of people down here, for example, just, you don't hear about it. It's so far away that they, like I said, they just wanted to kind of start putting a face with the name. You see an article every now and then, talking about it, but they just want to kind of get it out into the world, I guess.
That makes sense.
The wolf stuff is a tough one. I mean, it's, you talk about predator control and people have a tendency to start letting their own feelings come into it and things like that. So I don't know. I think the caribou you asked about the caribou population up there. I think the caribou population, is doing okay, generally speaking. But I don't want to speak to that too much because, again, my job is to go in and highlight what these guys are doing. To a certain extent, I also want to keep I would like to keep a step removed from it just a little bit because I, again, want to just educate people about what is happening with the project. Does that make sense?
No, it does. Because I've spoken with a fair number of wildlife photographers at this point through the podcast. And something that's really resonated with me is a focus on some folks who talk about like conservation. Obviously, being a wildlife enthusiast, it's something that you care about. I'm not saying you specifically, but folks care about and obviously want to take a step in. But a lot of conservation comes with getting people to care in the first place. And so like having these projects that just develop an appreciation for the animals and how beautiful and amazing their life is, it kind of plays in and doesn't necessarily have to have a motive as to helping to solve a certain problem. And sometimes a lot of the media that you're taking in through Instagram as like your average person always has that conservation focus and sometimes can be a little doom and gloomy and depressing. And sometimes just having a positive piece talking about the behaviors of these animals and why you should appreciate them and how beautiful they are, get people to care in a way that a conservation led campaign doesn't.
And I would agree 100% with you. That's something that you talk about using social media and things like that. That's something that I feel like I've been trying to use my social media for exactly that purpose, is just opening people's eyes to these things, kind of inspiring a sense of wonder about these things and letting people know that these things are out there, and just trying to inspire the sense of wonder as opposed to the idea of doom and gloom. I think people can get desensitized to the doom and gloom message. And I think people are more open to the wonder message. That's just my personal opinion.
Yeah. And if that wonder is instilled in the average person, it makes them care about the doom and gloom more. Otherwise, you kind of just turn off to it.
Exactly. And I think that that's a real problem that we've had in the conservation community, is that for a long time, the conversation is has been doom and gloom. And I think a lot of people have just become kind of apathetic to it, and I think apathy is the enemy.
Well, I thought what's cool too is for a lot of the projects that I've seen you working on, there seems to be a fun kind of crossover between research and photography based on who's funding some of the projects. Is that safe to say?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, where not only your conservation help through the photography not only helps from the wonder side, but it also helps from a sheer research side, is to help to answer the question that we were debating earlier in the conversation, which is, do the wolves need to be culled? Do they need to be supportive? And vice versa with the caribou. And sometimes just documenting this and helping researchers understand the population dynamics helps to inform that.
Oh yeah. And that's been, I think, one of the highlights for me of the work that I've been doing is going in and working with these research projects, whether it's nonprofits or the National Park Service or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and helping some of these projects figure out kind of creative ways to use cameras and figure out how they can use photography and stuff like that to further their scientific work. But then also, it's been fun to work with some of these projects and see them kind of take the bull by the horns with the social media aspect of it also. And really, I mean, that's really kind of, for me, new ground. I mean, if you talk to a lot of scientists out there, they could really care less about, pictures and stuff like that. They want to be writing articles and peer-reviewed stuff. And, that's furthering their goals or whatever. But it seems like more and more now, projects are interested in outreach for social media and educating the public about, what they're doing and things like that. And I think that's extremely important, especially when you're talking about governmental agencies, because they're spending our money.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I'm going to photograph some of these places and show you as a taxpayer, what are they doing with our money? How are they, so I think it's incredibly important for them also, because it adds a layer of transparency,
definitely,
that, a lot of people don't talk about, but I think it's really cool that they're embracing it. I mean, if you look at the Yellowstone Cougar Project, I was just talking with Dan Staler the other day. I think they have like 28,000 people following them. The Lynx Project up in Alaska that I worked with, I got a grant from the Fund for Environmental Journalism to go up and start a project with these guys. They've got a little over 20,000 people following them on Instagram now. And, so that, that right there, I mean, it shows that people are interested in what they're doing. It allows them to show those people how the, funds are getting spent. I just think it's really cool to be in that space right now.
Yeah. And how did you get involved in this in the first place? Is this something that's been a passion of yours forever as a kid? Or it seems like such a dream job for anybody on the outside looking in. What was kind of the genesis of everything?
When I was a kid, I would walk home from school, and when I walked home, I would go by the library every day at the university where my mom worked. And inside the library, they had bound copies of National Geographic in the back. And I would go into the library and I would just sit there for hours and hours flipping through these bound copies of National Geographic. And so I had always really kind of been into it, you know what I mean? Like attracted to it. And then I was kind of into photography. My dad was really into photography. So, you know, I wanted to get into it that way. And when I lived in Africa for a year, and he bought a camera for me to take there, like an old Minolta film camera.
Cool.
And, so I took it there and, you know, was trying to get into it and, you know, just learning as much as I could. And then when I got to college, I just kind of got out of it for a little while. I was, you know, still taking pictures and stuff like that, but I think I mainly got frustrated because I wasn't taking quality stuff. You know what I mean? I would be looking at Geographic and wondering why I wasn't taking pictures like that and just getting frustrated. And I started guiding fishing trips in the summers when I was in college. I started guiding fishing trips up in Jackson.
Okay.
And so I would go up there and, you know, it's a photographer's paradise, right? So
it's the most beautiful place I've been to in America. I'm literally obsessed with it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I started guiding fishing trips up there. And what I did is I started saving up my tip money and buying camera equipment again. And, you know, I knew that around that time, like guiding wasn't going to be a feasible long-term career for me. And I knew I needed something. And I was dating a girl at the time whose brother built websites.
Okay.
And he needed some pictures of some people that were fishing. And so I gave him some pictures and he bought 3 of them, I think. And as soon as he bought 3 of them, I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is what I can do for the rest of my life. And I started just really kind of getting back into it, buying equipment and reading books. I started, when I graduated from college, I got a degree in secondary education, social studies, so I could be a history teacher. But when I graduated from college, I knew that, you know, that probably was not the best scenario for me. So I started guiding snowmobile trips in the wintertime into the area around Jackson, up into Yellowstone and the mountains kind of east and south of there. And I just kept amassing photo stuff and reading books. I would keep books tucked in my bibs and stuff like that, just reading photo books. And it just kind of started snowballing, you know, started selling pictures here and there. And then I lived across the street from a guy who interned at a magazine called National Geographic Adventure.
Okay.
And I said to him one day, do you know anybody there who I could email to try and get on a needs list? You know, because a magazine will send out these needs lists every month for holes that they need to fill or whatever. He said, yeah, here you go. So he gave me her email. And I emailed her and she said, I'll put you on the list. And like 6 months later, they sent out a list and they needed some bison in the winter in Yellowstone. And I had been snowmobiling there with my camera gear.
Right.
And so I sent some in and I had one picture published. And like, it was like 3 or 4 months after that picture got published that I got an email from this guy, Taylor, who worked at National Geographic Creative. And he said, I've noticed some of your work in our publications. There had only been one picture. And he said, I also noticed that you're not represented by National Geographic Creative. You know, is that something that you'd like to talk about? And I emailed him back and I said, you know, hell yes. And that's how I got into National Geographic Creative. And long story short, I met Steve through that. And then he came out and ended up working on
Steve Winter, for everybody who is listening that doesn't know. Steve Winter is like, he's on I'm blanking on the mountain with all the presidents' names in it in South Dakota.
Now I'm blanking on it too.
Mount Rushmore. Oh my God. That's, I mean, If you ever did become a history teacher, they wouldn't be happy with you there.
I know. That's why I had to go into photography.
But yeah, Steve Winter is on the Mount Rushmore. Would you say that's safe to say of wildlife photographers, at least in my mind? And
oh yeah,
he's an absolute legend in terms of his work with big cats primarily, but I mean everything. Anyways, continue.
No, so I met. That's how I met Steve. Was at a reception at a National Geographic creative thing. And I was like, I live in Jackson. And he's like, oh, no way. And so I had been volunteering photographing this mountain lion project, just trying to build up a portfolio and, get out in the field and do cool stuff. And so I'd been documenting this mountain lion project forever. And they'd been letting me do everything but a capture sequence where they go out with the dogs and they run them up a tree and put a collar on them and all of this stuff. And like a week after I met Steve at that party, I got a call from the director of the nonprofit saying, Steve Winter's coming out with another guy from National Geographic, and they're shooting a pilot for a TV show. And we need some help logistically with snowmobiles. Can you help? And I said, yeah, sure. As long as I can take pictures of the capture. And he said, okay, well, I think we can do that. And Steve came out and he and I kind of hit it off. He said, well, why don't we go take some pictures on the last day? He said, let's go take some pictures tomorrow. And I said, okay. And I went and picked him up and we went out and we shot all morning. And then when we were driving back into town, he said, do you want to go to India for 4 months? And I said, sure. And that was my first assignment with National Geographic, was going to India for 4 months, working with him on a tiger story.
Oh my God. So was that, did it ever click where you're like, oh my God, I can actually do this full time? Like, had it reached that point before the India trip, or was it well after that? I mean,
no, and it's still not like that. I mean, it's a tough business to make it in, man. I mean, it's peaks and valleys for sure. It's not ever one that you can feel comfortable in, I don't think, and just say, okay, it's happening now. I mean, everybody is hustling. No matter how successful they appear on Instagram or whatever, everybody is hustling. It's a tough place. It's a tough business to make it in now.
And is that largely due to the lack of, I mean, when you look at wildlife publications, you really think Nat Geo, maybe BBC and Planet Earth. Is it a lack of institutions that are finding the audiences to promote the work through? Because I mean, I look at you, and not brown nosing in any way, but you're probably one of the biggest wildlife photographers on Instagram in terms of followers. And it's surprising to hear that.
Well, I mean, it's tough, there's, like you said, there's not a lot of places I think that are interested in buying it. When you look at the work that inspired me, say the work by National Geographic as a kid, that stuff takes an incredibly long time to get, right? And so, but the part of the problem I think also now is the volume of stuff out there. I mean, before the MO used to be that only a few people could afford to spend the time to get this stuff, and only a few people could afford the technology required to get it. Now everybody has the technology required to get it, and there's millions of those units out there. So you don't necessarily have to have somebody spending 6 months in a location. You can have 3,000 people going to that same location over 6 months.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
yeah, that makes sense.
It's kind of turned it on its head, I guess, a little bit. But
and so how do you find a way to differentiate yourself in that situation?
Man, I think what a lot of people in my shoes will tell you is that we're trying to tell people stories. You know what I mean? If I look at Instagram now, if I look at social media now, what I see is a lot of people taking amazing images, but that lack any kind of depth about or background about, anything. It's just a beautiful starry night picture or something like that. You know what I mean? And that's totally fine. I love taking those pictures too, but where I try and differentiate myself is by adding the context of a story, whether that's conservation or the wonder stuff that we talked about earlier, trying to make it a little bit more than just about the picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's really evident in a lot of your work. I mean, the captions are strong. I think Steve's too, and Paul Nicklin's. Like, you go on to their website, and a lot of the biggest reason I started this podcast is I'd scroll through my Instagram feed, and all I do is follow wildlife. I mean, it's pretty much the only one big passion I have. And every time I'd be like, oh, that's a beautiful photo, but I'd really want to learn more about what was it like to be in that scenario? How did you get that close to that animal? What was the environment like? What was their behavior like? Was it completely wild, or was it kind of like a faux wild experience? And people like yourself and Steve and Paul had these crazy stories. I mean, some of the captions were like novels that I had to take 20 minutes to read through. And that's where I really got excited and wanted to hear more about the stories. Is just, I think a lot of those pictures lack that certain depth that I was interested in learning more about.
Sure. Yeah, I hear you. I think, a lot of people that are out there that are always there are a lot of people out there that ask me all the time about, how do I take the next step in my photo career or something like that. And it always kind of goes back to that same idea. You'll hear everybody, all the professionals will tell you, hone in on something and tell the story of that something. And that will help, that'll kind of at least help differentiate you from the millions of other people out there just taking snaps.
Right. And so when you are looking, like, for the thing with the National Park Service or the Cougar Project or the Lynx Project, are those typically things that you're going and pitching and saying, hey, I think I can really help out with some of your research? Or is there a similar list that's going out like National Geographic sends out, or does your agency find those, or is it strictly kind of the hustle like you were talking about?
It's a hustle for sure. Luckily for me, when I started doing it, I had that same idea suggested to me by a Hispanic photographer named Patricio Robles Gill, fantastic wildlife photographer. And, he said, focus on one thing. Maybe you could focus on mountain lions. And so what I did is I started hounding the mountain lion research places around me. And, eventually, in the beginning, they said, no, we don't want anything to do with you. Because like I said, a lot of those guys could care less about this stuff. They want, peer reviewed papers and stuff like that. But I kept hounding them and got in, and that was kind of my entrance into it. And I think it started snowballing after that. And so now, in the beginning, it was straight hustle. Now people see my work on Instagram or something like that and will contact you and say, hey, let's work on a project, or, it just kind of depends. Another wildlife photographer named Joe Reese, who'd be a good guy to talk to you about this podcast, actually hooked me up with the director up in Alaska. So, it's your peer network, it's your hustle, it's what you're passionate about, you just have to kind of put it together, I guess.
Is there a particular project that stands out as the most exciting or your favorite that you've done thus far?
I don't know. That's a tough question too. Anytime I have a chance to go try and do any kind of mountain lion related work, I'll be there. That has been some of the highest octane type of stuff in terms of chasing cats around and watching them do captures and stuff like that, and setting cameras up and stuff. For me, I think maybe one of my favorites was probably the first assignment that I got from National Geographic, kind of working on my own. I had, worked for Steve for a couple of years. And, he and I had a great relationship. We still have a great relationship. I talk to him constantly about ideas and stuff like that. But I knew I needed to step away, and, I wanted to do my own thing. And so I did. And the first time I got contacted to do some work on my own was from an editor at Geographic named Kurt Muchler, to photograph grizzly bears eating white bark pine cones. And that one might be my favorite, just because it was my first one on my own. It was grizzly
Right.
bears. It was a lot going on.
I saw grizzly bears in person for the first time last end of April in Yellowstone. And I always knew that were one of my top 3 favorite animals, but seeing them in the wild was one of the most magnificent things I've ever seen. Granted, it was off the side of the road, which wasn't as, I always wish I was kind of in the middle of it a little bit more.
Well, just, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Have you had any scary moments like that? I would imagine grizzly bears in general seem like the kind of the alpha, sometimes aggressive animal to be out there filming in the wild.
Yes, they are for sure. I think I read something that, said the Yellowstone grizzly bear was considered the most dangerous grizzly bear, like more dangerous than bears up in Canada, more dangerous than bears up in Alaska.
Oh, really?
And I kind of joke with people when I tell them that, because I think the bears down here are more or less just agitated that they have to eat things like pine cones and they don't get to eat salmon like the bears up in Alaska do all the time.
Right.
But yeah, man, I have had a chance to run across 2 bears in the wild. I think both times, I was probably doing things that, I put myself in those situations. You know what I mean? I think when you hear about bear attacks and stuff like that, that people are putting themselves in that situation to a certain extent.
Sure.
So, it was an accident for sure. But the first time I got charged by a bear was working on a film called American Cougar with a cinematographer named Jeff Hogan. And we needed some shots of wolves, just some B-roll type shots of wolves, in the landscape. And so I was out one morning, kind of towards the end of shooting, looking for some wolves. And I pulled up to this spot. And I'd been sitting in my truck for a little while, just kind of trying to figure out what to do next. And I'm backing out of the parking spot, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this kind of shape go over this little rise off in the distance. And I was like, oh, perfect. That was a black wolf, because it was fairly small and dark, but I couldn't really see it, but I was like fairly confident it was a black wolf. So I threw the truck in park and I hopped out, closed the door, left my bear spray in the truck, and I started walking down the road. And then I kind of cut off the road and come up over this little knoll, and I'm looking off to my left, and off to my right, I hear this kind of like almost huffing, like barking sound. It's like, it's a crazy sound. And I look off to my right, and this grizzly bear is bearing down on me, and I don't have any, no bear spray, no nothing.
What?
And so I just kind of like stand there.
What distance are we talking about right now?
I to be honest with you, I don't remember distance. It was open space. It was open sagebrush.
Oh God.
And I don't remember the distances, because the bear was running at me, and then it stopped and it got up on its hind legs and it started swaying back and forth from left to right. And I was just standing there, like staring at this bear, and it got down on all fours and it started running in the opposite direction. And I was just like, holy cow, so I start backing down over towards this road. Like,
did you think you were out of it at this point, or were you like relieved?
I had no idea. So I was kind of like sidestepping along this rise over to the dirt road that I had walked off.
Right.
And I kind of got off of this, and I kind of got it off to the side, like right next to the road, and the bear stopped and turned around and got up on its hind legs again and started swaying back and forth. And then it got down on all fours and it started running at me again. And I just stood there again watching this bear run at me, and it stopped short and pulled up again, got up on its hind legs and started swaying back and forth. And I was just like,
oh my God.
So it got down on all fours and started running the opposite direction again. And so
they can run. Like that's fast.
Exactly.
That's a fast animal.
And so I backed down off of the rise onto the road, and walking backwards the whole way back to my truck on the road, just expecting to see this bear launching over this rise, like this road cuts through it just to annihilate me. And I finally back down to my truck, and I get back to my truck, and the bear comes running around the corner and stands up in the willows and looks at me like this, and then
No way.
runs off into the willows. Yeah. And so I hung out there for a little while after I got back to the truck. And I think what happened is that when I pulled up there in the morning, I had seen like 3 cow elk bounding off into the aspen.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the bear just killed one of their calves. And so I walked up there like right after all of that stuff happened. So the bear was super unhappy that I was there because it was all amped up from killing this calf, and it was crazy. It was like a dream.
A nightmare, more like it. Jesus, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
What was going on in your head? Did you think you were like, this is it, I'm going to die? Were you scared, or were you kind of just like, I could imagine sometimes the adrenaline that might hit you there, you don't even know what the hell's going on.
To be honest with you, I don't really remember a whole lot of it. I remember just standing there, not running. Like, remember thinking, don't turn your back. You know what I mean? Like, stand your ground, like, don't move. But and that time it worked out. You know what I mean? That time it worked out, and I got out of there. The second time that I got charged by a bear was completely different. You know, and I don't know if it was because of my reaction or what, but both times it seems like things slow down, and you have time to like think, but then at the end you're just like,
where was the second one?
The second one was working on that assignment, trying to photograph these bears eating white bark pine cones for Geographic. I think it was in 2014, maybe.
In Yellowstone?
Right on the eastern edge of the park. It was in the national forest, but up in the mountains between Cody, Wyoming, and Red Lodge, Montana, kind of.
Okay.
Like, we were camped at, say, 10,000 feet, beautiful area. And so we had gone out into the woods. Well, the first year I did it was just me. And so that was very stressful because you're going to these areas where these bears are trying to come in and eat these cones that these squirrels are saving to help get them through the winter. Well, the bears eat them too. Mm-hmm. And so you're walking around in the woods trying to find these spots where these bears are going into hyperphagia, like trying to eat as many of these cones as they can. And you're just, stumbling around in the woods trying to find these spots so you can
right.
set up a camera. Right. So, I mean, I was wound up tighter than a snare drum on this assignment.
Yeah, I can imagine. Why are they eating pine cones?
Well, the cones have an incredible amount of calories in them. And so they're trying to put on as much fat at that time of year as they can, so that they can go into hibernation and, make it through the winter. So they're trying to raid all of these squirrel middens as often as possible. And it's another one of these kind of heated debates as to whether or not the bears rely on this food source, and need it and need to be listed as an endangered species, or they don't need it quite so much and they find food other spots. But anyway,
right.
They do eat the cones.
Okay.
And so I was there to photograph it. But so yeah, going around trying to find these spots. Eventually I had, I think, 8 cameras set up in this area. And I was going to a camera that was kind of along a lake. And I was walking along the lake, and this was like 20, well, at this point it was like 16, 17 days into the assignment, something like that. Had gotten nothing so far. This is my first assignment from Kurt Muchler, so I needed to hit a home run.
Right.
And not fail. And I had been failing. So that added with going to all these spots with these bears was just like tearing me up every day.
Right.
So I'm going to this spot along the lake, and it's nice and open along the lake, and walking along, and I get to where the camera is, and I turn, and there's a space of, I don't know, maybe 20 feet from the edge of the lake to the trees where the forest starts. And it's like a wall of thick green trees. So I walk up to the trees. I'm getting ready to go into the forest. I'm probably about a foot away from it or so. My camera was set up in a squirrel midden that was just past the edge of the trees, maybe 15 or 20 feet. And a bear had been feeding in this squirrel midden and it had fallen asleep. Because when I would go up to these things, I would, bang, make noise, yell, hoot and holler, and all of this stuff. And the only thing that I can come up with is that the bear had gorged himself on these cones and just totally passed out. Because, like I said, I was banging stuff, cracking sticks, hooting and hollering, and all of this stuff. So I walk up, I'm about a foot away from the trees to go into it. And I think it smelled me, and it woke up and immediately turned and started crashing through the trees in my direction. And I couldn't see anything. I knew how far away it was because I knew where the camera was and where the squirrel midden was. But I couldn't see a single thing in front of me because it was just solid green.
So you just hearing it charge at you.
I just hear it. That same
God.
like barking kind of hoofing sound and it running right at you, but like right on top of you. And I was packing a pistol at the time. I had bear spray at a time, but I just assumed by this point that there was no bear there. So I had nothing ready. All I did was just start screaming. I just started, hey, 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 hey. And it just put on the brakes and it turned around and it started heading the other direction.
Oh my God. I wonder if it didn't know what you looked like because it was so thick too and might have thought you were something else.
I don't know. I have no idea.
Do you think bear spray in those situations would even work? I've done that. I was walking around in Glacier and had it with me, and the cover was so thick that I was like, if a bear ever gets close to me, there's no way in hell it's going to get stopped by this stuff.
I'm not sure.
Not something you want to find out, I guess.
Well, that's not something you want to find out. They just did a study that came out, I think, a year or two ago that said that bear spray is more effective than firearms. But, when you're dealing with getting charged by a bear, like I said before, it's always because something has gone wrong. It's never like you're watching this bear off in the distance and it's just hanging out, doing its thing. And then all of a sudden it starts running at you.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're crashing through the brush, or you're coming up over a rise and it just killed a elk calf and you're not prepared. I mean, that's when the bear attacks happen. So what you need to be doing is walking around in those situations with something in your hand.
Yeah.
And so what I do now is if there's any question about what I'm doing, I walk around with bear spray in my hand. And, the pistol for me is not necessary. I have no dreams about hitting a charging bear with a 44 Magnum.
No.
But what I have the pistol for is because it's the loudest thing that I can carry. You know what I mean? It's the thing that could scare them. Mm-hmm. Hearing this thunder stick, you know what I mean? And so that's what I carry the pistol for. What I started carrying the second year that I did the bear work was a little boating air horn. I carried that in my hand so that if I was going into somewhere and, if I was going in somewhere and a bear started coming at me, I'd just lay on the air horn, just,
right.
Get out of here. So.
I mean, that's why I'm surprised, like, especially in the first story where it's kind of on its hind legs, like it's probably guarding something. Yeah. Have you ever read the book Grizzly Year?
No.
Have you heard of it?
Yes.
It's such a fascinating book, but it's the guy he comes back from Vietnam and ends up spending 6 months a year tracking grizzlies in either Glacier or Yellowstone.
Is he the guy that uses the poncho? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. It's a fascinating story about this guy who, I mean, understandably so, he just comes back from Vietnam so messed up because he saw a lot of action and just hates living in society. So he goes out by himself year after year after year. Just, I mean, it was back in the day where I think he was recording on film and would just do get an assignment here and there, but basically just lived as a nomad, filming bear mating habits and eating habits. And sure enough, had a number of those experiences.
I am pretty sure he's the guy that it's a great idea. He would wear a poncho. And so if he was standing there filming the bear, something like that, and all of a sudden the bear started acting aggressive, or he thought there was going to be an issue, he would just open up his poncho. So he would be like a hood on a cobra. He would be getting bigger.
Right.
And deterring saying, don't come over here because I'm, 3 times as big now.
Right.
I'm pretty sure this is the same
That's
guy.
super smart. And that's what I was thinking is, I don't know if I'm a bear, if I have any self-awareness as to how big and massive of an animal I am. If I saw somebody, it's always interesting to me how many times they charge and then stop and then kind of back away and then charge and then stop and back away. It's a very like repetitive process. You would think it would just be like, I'm going to absolutely destroy this guy. I've got 5 times the weight on him, and
I kind of feel like, me personally, having been in those situations, I feel like the bear is deciding while it's charging you if it's going to annihilate you or if it's going to, turn and run off. I told this story to a guy one time, and he looked at me, he said, "Oh, it was a false charge." And I just thought that phrase was so funny because, I was convinced that the bear was going to kill me in that first scenario, but it stopped and it pulled up and it, started swaying back and forth. I have no idea. I feel like in the heat of the moment, the bear is deciding whether or not you're going to get it or not.
Yeah. And it's almost like it's wondering if you're going to interfere with its shit or not, because I think at a certain point, it's not that it's worried that it could take you or not. It's just, I got this elk calf over here. I don't know if it's worth my energy to go swipe this guy down or not. I just want him to go away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Again, it depends. A lot of this stuff, it depends on who you talk to.
Well, I kind of equate it to, I saw a video that you posted about a cougar that was kind of chasing off eagles that were coming off of something that had just killed. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Uh-huh.
And I don't think that it ever had any expectation. I guess it helps to set the stage. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on there? And I can kind of link it to my thought on the bear.
Well, cougars, mountain lions are very secretive and they don't like anything giving away their location. So if they kill something, if they kill an elk or a deer or whatever, they'll cache it. They'll cover it up with sticks and rocks. But eventually eagles, ravens, stuff like that, magpies will find it. And, they'll come in and start scavenging on it. And I filmed this female cougar coming down to this kill, and she would repeatedly come chase this golden eagle off of her kill.
Yeah, and my thought there was, if you look at the cougar, it looks like it's charging full speed and trying to get something, but it knows it's not going to catch that eagle. I almost equated to it. Sorry.
It very well could, for sure.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you go into cougar kills and, a lot of times you'll find feathers just everywhere because, it's just like cougars are just like house cats.
Right.
That, they'll take a bird down for sure. I'll tell you a story. The coolest thing that I've ever witnessed in nature was working on that American Cougar film. And we had spotted a cat that made a kill on a very steep slope. And she killed it in the morning, and she had bedded down up above it about 100 yards or so under a tree. The kill was out on an open slope. And 2 ravens found it almost immediately. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we found it. A lot of times when you're out there, you can see ravens flying around. And if you follow the ravens or whatever, you can find kills and stuff like that. And so that's how we ended up finding it. And we watched, and we were about a mile away or so. And we watched as these 2 ravens would circle over this kill and get lower and lower, just very slow, ever so slowly, right? Mm-hmm. And the lion would stand up and start creeping down the hill, just like, a house cat getting ready to pounce on something.
Right.
And eventually the ravens would get low enough that they would see the mountain lion creeping down the hill, and they would go fly back up. And then they would start circling, and the mountain lion would turn around and go up and lay down under the tree. And then they'd start circling lower again. And that same thing would happen. I don't know. We probably watched it happen for at least a couple hours.
Right.
And the last time, the ravens got low enough, but they didn't see the lion standing there. and the lion exploded. And I'm talking extremely steep terrain. And it jumped. It was probably, I don't know, it was probably 8 to 10 feet off of the ground going downhill. You know what I mean? Jumping like downhill is probably 8 to 10 feet off of the ground, swinging at these ravens in the air, trying to catch them. And it probably traveled 30 feet.
No way.
And it landed on all fours, and it looked up at the ravens, and then it just walked up and laid back down underneath the tree. Went to sleep.
That's crazy. Do you have that footage?
No, because I was not running the camera on that one. We had another guy running the camera, and he was letting the cat go in and out of the frame to try and cut a sequence together. And so I was on the binoculars trying to let him know what was going on with all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there with the researcher, and he's watching through a scope. I think I was watching through binoculars. And all of a sudden we started laughing, and the cameraman, who I will leave unnamed at this moment, said, "What?" And I said, "You didn't get that?" And he said, "Get what?" And he had let it just go out of frame and missed the whole thing. But we had a chance to see it.
Hey, well, sometimes those are better left to tall tales anyways.
That's right. But
that's crazy.
That's the coolest thing I've seen in nature. I mean, it was just incredible to see that cat swinging at the ravens, just giving it everything it had. And they will kill them for sure.
Well, it completely destroys the parallel I was trying to make was that it was just charging to get the birds away from there. But I guess it is a good point. I mean, I had a cat, a kitten that I had at home in Rhode Island growing up, and it was only like a year old, and it would bring back rabbits and birds. I mean, you understand why house cats should be left indoors most of the time. But you're kind of just like, it's mind blowing to think of how close I could ever get to a bird. There's no way in hell I could ever get to kill one if I wanted to. Not that I would, but they're just different animals, man.
That's still, I try to pre-visualize a lot of the pictures that I want to take. Mm-hmm. And that's still a picture that I think if you could just spend an inordinate amount of time focusing on, you could get a mountain lion killing a bird over a kill. Like, it could happen. I'm convinced that it could happen.
Do you find a lot of your good photo, or like your best photography, is happenstance like that, where you would never expect something like that to happen? You're kind of just in the right place at the right time? Or are there ever times where you're like, I want to get this specific behavior and I'm going to plant myself here until I see it?
Always. It's always that way. Okay. If you can get it's like anything, if you can get very specific with what you need, then you can go out and get it. But if you're, kind of vague about what you're looking for, then you're going to end up driving all over hell and back, shooting whatever.
Right.
But if you want a mountain lion eating an elk, you're going to do everything that you can to figure out how to go out there and shoot that mountain lion eating an elk, or, whatever it may be. But be specific. Yeah. Be specific. The geographic guys, they're looking for this behavior. They're looking for this animal. They're looking for this thing.
And is that what is the needs list usually that specific? Like, is that a common practice still at Nat Geo?
Well, Geographic, the magazine, doesn't send one out that I'm aware of, but it was for adventure, but they folded. Some other magazines, I think, still send out needs lists. I'm not on too many of them anymore, though. I mean, it's, that hasn't really been where I've been trying to focus a lot of my attention moving forward. A lot of my stuff has been social media driven, What's the next 5 years looking like? Like, what are you trying to focus on? Is there a specific phenomenon or project in mind, or is it multi-pronged? What's it looking like? Yeah, multi-pronged for sure. I think long-term outlook for me, one of the things that I've found is one of the things that I've been enjoying is trying to see what people engage with on my feed. You know what I mean? See what type of things people people like. And one of the things that people have been responding to a lot is video clips. You know what I mean? This idea of getting intimate behavior or just an intimate view into these animals' lives. And so I'm going to be focusing a lot on that moving forward, generally speaking. Subject wise, always mountain lion stuff. I have been working with a lynx project up in Alaska. We're still trying to figure out how to expand that and get some more work done. They're still doing all of their research now. It's always, like I said earlier, it's always a hustle. You know what I mean? Trying to figure out what the next thing is going to be.
For those intimate moments, something that strikes me from your work is you seem to be, or you're an incredible expert at the remote camera that I don't see with a lot of other people's work. Was that something that came out of necessity with some of these projects, or has that always been a passion of yours? Because the reason I love it is when you talk about those video clips, that's about as intimate as you can kind of get with some of these animals, because you're really witnessing their natural behavior without anything getting in the way.
Sure. The remote stuff came about again because I had been looking at geographic so much. You know what I mean? I tell people that I really studied the magazine for a long time. I mean, I didn't read a single word, just stared at the pictures and tried to figure out how they made them, And so I knew that the wildlife guys that I wanted to try and emulate were doing a lot of this remote camera work. And so I ended up picking up a Trailmaster unit and some flashes and trying to kind of piece that together on my own. And then when I met Steve, we talked about earlier, I made sure to tell him that I already had experience with camera traps and stuff like that. And he was like, oh, well, that's, perfect, because that's what I do. So that made it go hand in hand. Now, I don't know. I think for me, like the picture aspect of it is what really draws me to it. I enjoy trying to get camera trap pictures that nobody has ever seen before of animals that are, completely wild, like you're talking about. The thing that I'm trying to deal with is that people resonate more with video. Mm-hmm. Right. I could spend 8 months trying to get a picture of a mountain lion to line up perfectly with the background and stuff like that. But it would resonate more for somebody to watch a mountain lion walk through that landscape for 15 seconds or whatever it is, and some kind of mediocre video. That's where the tough balance is for me. I like shooting the pictures. The video, I feel, is necessary, but it's kind of a balance, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah, no, for sure. It's frustrating, you work so long on a picture like that. And now, I mean, when I started working at Geographic, it was still like if you nailed an amazing picture, you kept that super close. Like nobody saw that, and nobody, you didn't let it out of the room. Right now, if you nail one, get it out into the internet ether as quickly as possible. You know what I mean? And so to have to work for so long on some of those remote camera trap pictures, I mean, some of those camera trap pictures will take a year or more to get one frame, like amazing frame. Like that one behind you. Is that a remote trap? Yeah, this one behind me is the first picture that Steve and I set up, the first camera trap that Steve and I set up together in India. I mean, that's like, I honestly, when you sat down, I couldn't tell if it was a painting or not, because granted the video resolution here, it would help if I was in the room, but the way that their heads are positioned, it looks like they're, posing for a picture. Yeah. And, that's the part that I like about it, is kind of the almost kind of transcending the art in a way. You know what I mean? I definitely want to be an artist, and that allows the artistry. But, it's hard when you work so long on something like that to get it out and actually try and have it resonate with people to where they'll be inspired to learn more about tigers or mountain lions or whatever, is tough, because now people just scroll right by it.
Yeah.
You know, that picture that took you 10 months to nail, people will double tap and like it and then scroll right by it.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so that's a tough thing to
Well, it's a weird, almost like double-edged sword, right? Where social media has democratized things so much that becomes normal. But at the same time, it's also opened up your reach so much that you're getting all these inquiries from the National Park Services to do the work. But I almost feel like it's amazing for, I mean, maybe the 1 to 10 people who used to be able to hold things tight and sell it to National Geographic. Like, it's definitely kind of a bummer for them, but for people who are on the more amateur side of things, it's somewhat encouraging, because then you're like, okay, maybe I can get some reach.
Sure.
But I mean, for folks like yourself, I can imagine it's a love-hate relationship, because you are clearly one of the people who would sell those photos for a shit ton of money to National Geographic.
It's tough. I mean, you know, it's a tough one. I think that's where that's where the passion for subject matter has to come in.
Sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you know, dealing with the peaks and valleys of the financial realities of being a professional photographer, or, you know, equipment, or any of those issues. You know, at the end of the day, the stuff that keeps you going back out into the field is the stuff that you're passionate about. You know what I mean? And and like I said, I want to see animals doing stuff that nobody's ever seen. You know what I mean? I want to be there checking it out.
Can you talk a little bit about the extreme lengths you've gone to? Is there a specific shot or camera trap that you set up that gives people a perspective as to the lengths to which you would go to get a photo?
Oh man. Well, I guess if I had to think of one, you know, I worked on the National Geographic Yellowstone assignment. And I was on that one to do mountain lion stuff. And I think probably that one was a picture of a mountain lion with an elk rack in front of it, this full 6-point elk rack. And I remember seeing the location, and I, you know, was supposed to be looking for locations that had this grand vista in the background where you could see a mountain lion in the landscape, which, you know, we found some suitable stuff, and, you know, set cameras up there. And I kept walking past this elk rack where we knew that this cat was walking, right? And this rack was just in Yellowstone alongside this trail, you know, out in the backcountry. And excuse me, I looked at it and I thought, man, this is a perfect scenario. I mean, the rack is laying like a foot away from the trail. And so I finally said, the heck with it. And I set up a camera there, and it took like 3 months for everything to come together to get the first picture of the cat going through there. Right. And it was not a usable picture. It was a kind of like the tail end of the cat. Right. And it was walking away and stuff. And the lighting was kind of blasé. And so I went back in there, readjusted some stuff. And in the end, at the end of the day, it took just about 12 months. Almost a whole year, well, maybe a little less, maybe like 11 months to get the picture of this cat walking in front of this elk rack. And so that, you know, what that entails is going into that trap every, say, 2 weeks, hiking into it and servicing it and fixing broken stuff, which in that case, there was a lot of, because there was a cinnamon black bear that would just go up and down this trail, and all the cameras that I had there, he would chew up cables chew the flashes or knock the cameras over. So, you know, in the summertime, it was, you know, it was working who knows what percentage of the time. And then in the wintertime, you're dealing with dead batteries and, you know, snow and things like that. So you're, you know, always back and forth servicing your cameras while they're in the field. The whole time, essentially getting nothing. That's the hardest part.
Right.
That's the hardest part about the camera trap work, you know. And
like finding the picture, right? Like you must be going through thousands of pictures just trying to find if you did get anything, right? Is that how it works? Or does it set off like a motion trigger?
It sets off a motion trigger.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. So, if you have a couple thousand pictures on your card, something happened, like something fell in front of the trigger and it just took a bunch of pictures. You want to get to the camera and have there be like 4 or 5 pictures or however many pictures.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Because nothing happened except when the camera was triggered.
I always assumed it was on like a one shot every 60 seconds type of deal.
No. So it's, you talk about the setup for them. I will kill myself to find a location for a camera trap picture. It's one thing to go out into the woods and look and say, there's a trail where a deer will walk, and put up a camera and get a picture of a deer walking by. That is fairly straightforward. Mm-hmm. It's another to hike all over creation and find a trail that has a river and this mountain kind of scene in the background. So, for me in camera trap work, the composition is the most important thing. It's number one. So like I said, if I'm doing a still picture, I will hike all over the place looking for that one spot. Then I'll find that spot and I'll go in and basically, none of it is luck. That's where a lot of this animal behavior stuff comes in, right? Mm-hmm. So you find the trail, and then what you do is you find your composition of where exactly you want the animal to be, right? So it's not, well, maybe it'll be here, maybe it'll be here. It's the picture is set for the animal to stand. Right here.
I always wondered that because in terms of like aperture and focus and everything, my guess is if it's not exactly where you want it to be, it's out of focus or kind of screws up the whole composition of the photo.
It can be for sure, especially if you're using flashes and stuff like that. Like none of it is, happenstance. It's all.
Do you ever crawl around pretending to be the mountain lion in the frame to take the photo and make sure?
All the time.
Yeah, that's what I figured. That's hilarious.
One of my favorite pictures, one of my favorite kind of sequences of pictures is from when my daughter was born. She came up to the Beartooths with my wife. Mm-hmm. My daughter was like 3 months old or something at the time. No. She was a little older. She's like 6 months old at the time, and came up to the Beartooths, and we went out to finish setting up this camera trap. And instead of me getting in and testing everything and the lighting and all of that stuff, we sat my daughter in there to test
that's so cute.
We have a picture of my daughter sitting there, smiling at her mom who's just off camera. And then right next to it is a picture of a 400-pound grizzly bear in the same frame.
Oh my God.
Sniffing around for, white bark pine cones.
That's amazing.
So yeah, we'll have people helping us, or I'll do it myself or whatever, but it's always, supposed to look exactly like
it's got to be fun though, right? If you're pulling those cards, knowing that it's taken 4 photos and just crossing your fingers that this works out.
Yeah, exactly. I don't go up to camera traps anymore. Like, all right, this is gonna. I've been let down enough to know that it's probably not there, but it's the idea of working for this thing that's never been seen and trying to just get this like minuscule piece of perfection for just a 15th of a second or whatever that drives me nuts about it. That's why I will hike forever looking for that location. That's why I will rip the whole thing down and put it up again to make it look perfect. You know what I mean? That's what's always drawn me to it.
Is there one camera trap photo that stands out as your favorite?
Not necessarily one. There's a few of them. They kind of, for me, it seems like at this point, different photos have marked different periods in my life.
Right. Yeah.
My career. You know what I mean? So for me, like this picture behind me of the 2 tigers that was the first camera trap that I set up under Steve Winter's tutelage. This one is extremely important for me just because of the bond that I have with Steve and how much that's opened my world and things like that. just across from me is a picture of the grizzly bears from that white bark pine assignment. That was a big one for me. The first time they asked me to do something on my own, got published as a double page. You know what I mean? So that one's important for me. I don't think I have one, but I think I look at them as marking these different periods of my life.
Do you have a photo of the grizzly that charged you?
No, I do not.
I was wondering if when it was sleeping beforehand, because
in the mid. No, I don't have one from that. No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Maybe better that way.
Yeah. Well, you never know, I guess. For the longest time, I thought the third time the charm, but last year up in Alaska, we had one that was standing like 40 feet outside the tent on our first night in camp. So,
were you awake during that?
Yeah, we had just flown in, actually. We had just flown in and set up camp, and we're like trying to figure out what we're going to do, because it hadn't been done before. We're just like, okay, well, now what? So we're kind of setting up camp, and the biologist, Matt, that I was with, he's like, well, I think I'm going to set the scope up. I'm just going to see if I can spot the den over there or, see anything over there. And so he sets the scope up, and like 10 minutes later, he's like, I think I see a wolf. And we're like, oh, okay. And so I get my binoculars and scope and set it up, and we see one over there. And we're like, great, because people had told us that the wolves would just pick up and leave even if the helicopter touched down there. They were just so afraid of the helicopters and stuff. So we were ecstatic. And, we're sitting there watching them. And then a couple minutes later, Matt's like, I think I see the den. And sure enough, he spotted the den on the hillside. And so we're just standing there like, this is incredible. We've been here for an hour. We found the den. We've already seen a wolf. We got camp set up. It's going nuts.
Right.
And so we're sitting there talking, and all of a sudden we look down below us in the river, and 3 wolves started climbing up the ridge on our side of the river. And we were like, oh my God. So we started screaming. I grabbed my camera. Matt's got his binoculars, and we're looking, and the wolves are coming up this ridge, and there's a grizzly bear behind the wolves. And I'm like, Matt, there's a bear behind the wolves. There's a bear behind the And he's like, where? And he finally sees it. And so the wolves keep coming up the ridge, and now they're across from our camp. They're, maybe 300 yards away or something like that, across from our camp. And they stop and they start looking back down the hill. It's like steep drop off on both sides from our camp. And so we're kind of looking across another draw. And Matt's like, what are they doing? And I said, they're looking at that bear, because they're looking right down below him. And I was like, where'd that be? And I was telling Matt, I was like, keep your eyes on the bear so we know where the bear's going. And so I was like, where's the bear? And he's like, I don't know. We lost it. So, so we're looking around. We don't see the bear, but the wolves are still across from the camp. So I go back to trying to get some photos and videos of the wolves across from the camp. And I run into the tent to grab something, and I hear Matt say, whoa. And I look out the tent door, and I see Matt standing there. And then off in the distance, that grizzly bear was standing, like I said, like 40 yards from the tent.
Oh, God.
And I don't think it knew that we were there. It just kind of crested the ridge and, heard Matt and stopped and turned and looked at Matt. And then I jumped out of the tent, went and stood next to him, and it turned tail and it just ran off. So for the longest time, I was thinking third time's the charm with those bear stories. Finally got it out of the way last year.
Jeez, talk about an epic first 30 minutes into a trip though, huh?
It was crazy. It was totally crazy.
Oh my God. You been in any other scary situations where you thought your health or safety was in jeopardy?
Not a ton. There was one instance with a mountain lion where I was kind of tracking this radio collared mountain lion back in the early days when I was volunteering with that project. And I knew that she was underneath this tree. right? And I kind of knew that she was in this vicinity, and I didn't know that she was as close to me as she was. And so I was kind of walking along trying to figure out where she was, looking, and she stood up and walked out from underneath this tree. And she was probably, I don't know, 75 yards or something like that away, which is no big deal. Like, generally speaking, I think mountain lions are fairly tame.
Right.
But I think I woke her up. I don't think that she knew I was there. So I think I woke her up, and she walked out, and she was just standing there staring at me. And I was in the snow, and I went, and I was closer than I had anticipated. So I went to start taking a step backwards, and I fell through the crust on the snow, like up to my thigh.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I fell through the crust on the snow, she took like 4 immediate steps towards me, like, coming right at me. You know what I mean? And I was like, oh, geez. But then I stood up, and she took off, and I backed out of there.
Oh, you were able to get your other leg to push up?
Yeah. I, flailed around and finally got out of there.
Ooh, that would be a rough way to encounter a cat when you're just waist deep in snow trying to get yourself out if you couldn't.
Yes, exactly.
What other trips did you take with Steve? Anywhere outside the U.S.?
Yeah, we did. Man, we went all over the place. We did work in Thailand, India, Ecuador. You talk about things that will kill you. I think a lot of the older guys at Geographic will tell you that it's the small things. The jungle guys will tell you the small things will kill you. And they're absolutely right. I went down to the Amazon with Steve on one of the last assignments we did together. And I ended up getting some infection down there that really just, I don't know if I've ever really gotten over it. I mean, I dealt with it like fairly intensely for probably 3 years, 4 years. It was crazy.
Like an insect, kind of like a malaria type thing?
Well, no, for me, it was an infection of some kind. So I was going out to check. The way that it started, at least as far as I remember it happening, is I went out to check a camera trap, and I got to this last camera, and it looked like a frog or frogs had laid eggs everywhere, like millions of frog eggs all around this camera trap. And, I just waded in there and knelt down in it and was checking the camera and stuff like that and doing my thing. And the next day I was leaving Ecuador, coming back out. And so check the camera, everything was fine, go back to the research station, pack up. And the next morning on my shin, it looked like I had a bunch of little tiny zits all up and down my shin, like white-headed zits. And so going out, I lifted up my pant leg and showed it to one of the local guys, and I was like, "What is this?" And he said, "Oh, it's just it's kind of our version of poison ivy. Don't sweat it." And I was like, "No problem." So go home, and it kind of goes away. But as it goes away, my left knee swells up. And I mean, it's incredibly painful.
Yeah.
Like so much so that I can hardly walk around.
Okay.
So I go in, and they cut it open, and they have to drain it out and all of this stuff. And they start giving me all these drugs, and I tell them about what happened. And he's like, "Okay, well, here's all of these antibiotics. Start taking this stuff." And so I take it, and it goes away. And then like 3 months later, it came back in my other knee. And so
that's scary. And then it's like traveling around.
Yeah, it was crazy. So, again, drug cocktail. But, long story short, it came back on both knees, on the back of my thigh, on my butt, and on my cheek.
Oh, God.
Yeah. And
did they ever figure out what it was?
Nope. No.
So they just
but it
pumped you full of antibiotics until it went away?
Yeah, that's right. It's I'm very good friends with Keflex now. Keflex is the antibiotic of choice, apparently, for combating this. But yeah, so now, I mean, it was so bad that now, to be honest with you, I don't travel anywhere unless I have, heavy duty antibiotics just in case it comes back.
You'll like prep with them? Almost take them before? Wow.
Yep.
Jeez, that's scary.
And, that is tame compared to, some of the other guys out there. You talk to a guy named Charlie Hamilton James. I mean, he's got like a big, indentation in his shin from leishmaniasis in the jungle. That's like a flesh eating type of thing or something, I believe. I mean, my story is tame compared to some of that stuff.
I get a sense that the jungle is a tough place to be as a human. I think like when I hear you talking about camping in Alaska, camping in Yellowstone, I'm jealous. And I'm like, oh, I would love to be doing that out in grizzly country, smelling the pines. When I hear about trekking through frog eggs in the jungle with all the bugs down there and the heat and the humidity, I'm like, nah, I'm okay with that. Thank you though.
The jungle will get you, man. I mean, it is a tough place. But I mean, people love it, right? I mean, Steve loves the jungle.
Really?
I hate it. I mean, I'll go there. I'll go work there happily. You know what I mean? But I wouldn't necessarily try and hunt down assignments there. For me, I'm trying to hunt down assignments, like you say, camping out with grizzly bears up in the Alpine. But, each into their own, for sure.
Yeah, I just feel like the creepy crawly things around there, the snakes, the piranhas. No thanks. I'm a North American person, I think.
Yeah. I hear you.
I know we're getting pretty close on time here, so I wanted to hit a few rapid fire questions, if you don't mind, at the end here. What would you say your favorite animal is that's unexpected to photograph, or favorite animal that you photographed that unexpectedly was fun or that you enjoyed?
Pika.
I don't even know what a pika is. Is that like a little mole kind of thing?
It's the smallest member of the rabbit family. It looks like a mouse. It looks like a rodent. It doesn't have a long tail. It's about the size of your fist, maybe a little smaller than your fist.
Like Pikachu? Is that where it comes
from? I don't know if that's where it comes from, but that's when most people see it on my social media, that's what they reference.
And what do you like about photographing them?
They don't want to kill you. They're soft and cuddly, and they're awesome. They just, whenever people see pika, they smile, and it brings a smile to people's face. And whenever you see them in the wild, it brings a smile to people's face, and it's an unexpected animal. You know what I mean? There's a market for sexy stuff, polar bears, stuff like that, the big sexy things.
Right.
Pika don't have that, but they absolutely get a response of, a visual response from people when they see them. So I enjoy going after them.
Is there one moment in your career, and this may be way too broad of a question, but one moment that sticks out as being particularly special where you're out in the wild and just recognize that you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing?
Oh man, that's that's a tough one too. I think, I think one moment that stood out for me, I got to see 7 mountain lions, all in the same spot, doing the same thing.
Wow.
And I was the first person to really document this. And for me, that was really amazing. I was sitting on this ridge in the wind. I mean, it was like 15 degrees. I was sitting there shivering, watching this behavior play out in front of me, recording it. And, at that time I was, I think I was in the moment. It was just, everything was firing on all cylinders. I think that was one of the top ones for me.
What were they doing? Aren't they typically pretty solitary?
Yes. Well, that, and that's the thing is that, people had kind of speculated that they might hang out more than they do for a long time, but nobody had really documented it before. Nobody had really seen it. And they were all hanging out at a kill. Two females started hanging out together, and they had 2 kittens apiece. So I got to see the 2 females and 4 kittens, and then there was a collared male that was hanging out with them as well. So, I mean, it was crazy.
Wow, that's insane.
Yeah.
When you think of conservation issues that are at the forefront right now, being so boots on the ground and having such a grassroots understanding and being involved in that network, is there anything in general that sticks out as one of the more pressing issues?
I think the most pressing issue with conservation is that we need to figure out ways to work together. Mm-hmm. I think that everything is becoming so polarized now that it's either you're with me or you're against me. And I think what it needs to be is we are in this together. And I think if we can all start to realize that nature kind of satisfies our own needs within us, we can respect that it satisfies other people's needs too. And we can start working together to figure out how to save stuff. Because I think if you look at the track record of working independently, I don't know if we're doing a very good job. You know, we might be spending a lot of money, but I don't know if we're doing a very good job. But I think if we can start bringing people from different parts of, you know, the world, different thought, you know, different backgrounds, I think then we'll really be setting ourselves up for success. And I think that's the most pressing thing to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that even goes well beyond wildlife and conservation in general. I think we live in a very polarized time,
right,
largely because of the algorithms that are being fed to our Facebook feeds. But
sure.
I mean, I don't know if I've told you much about it, but right now I'm working on a documentary called Feral on the overpopulation of feral cats in Hawaii. And they're linked to the predation on a lot of critically endangered seabirds, and they spread toxoplasma, which is getting into the water and killing endangered monk seals, spinner dolphins, etc. And while it's like pretty widely accepted that the cats need to come off the landscape, whether that be through sterilization, humane euthanasia, sanctuaries, etc., there's just a huge conflict around people whose identities are not identities, but are just so passionately for one way, and it's one way or the other. And when I was doing the
identities is a good way to put it, because for a lot of those folks, I think a lot of their identity is wrapped up in that stuff. I don't think that's a bad way to put it.
Yeah, and it's the frustrating thing is, I mean, for a lot of trying to promote it or trying to get people involved with the film, people have been so what's your opinion? What do you think? And I certainly have opinion, and I have ideas as to where it could be best solved. But I think the largest thing I'm trying to do is provide the problem an objective platform through which people can just start coming together to cooperatively solve things, because I think so many things are being done independently that there needs to be a collective effort in one direction, because otherwise you're just moving a millimeter forward in 12 different directions instead of taking giant steps forward. And it kind of goes hand in hand with what you're saying is, I think if you're not being cooperative in the solutions, regardless of whether it's exactly what you want or not, it's very hard to move forward.
That's right. And, you know, that's, again, kind of talking about this idea of social media, you know, that's been one of my main goals for my social media feed. You know, I really look at the social media stuff as a gift. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I kind of feel like it's a gift for me to try and offer a place for people to come together and celebrate things, as opposed to complain about the way things are going.
Yeah. I mean, I even remember one of yours where you're like, here's a picture of it was like a collared mountain lion. And you're like, let's not get into like a crazy debate as to whether these animals should be collared or not, but let's talk about the photo and how beautiful it is or something like that.
Yeah. You know, it just, you know, I want to use that as a kind of like this clearinghouse where we can all realize again that nature satisfies these needs for all of us, and we're all in it together.
Sure. And I think a big part of that too is when you think about how you can actually help to solve these problems through funding. When you look at the organizations or the government officials that could actually help, a lot of times when these things become so radicalized and so polarized, these guys don't want to touch them with a 90-foot pole. And so nothing ends up being done, and it ends up
Right.
screwing both sides of the argument.
Right.
Anyways, that's a lot of what I'm working on right now. And I just went on a little diatribe. So
No, it's fine.
please forgive me for that.
It's good that you're passionate about it. I mean, like I said before, I mean, the passion is what, if for anybody out there who's wondering about whether or not I should get into this or, keep following my dream of doing this, think about your passion. And is that something that is going to sustain you through dealing with people who may not see your vision as clearly as you do, or, may have different ideas on conservation than you do,
Sure.
or, whatever, so I love hearing it, man.
Thank you. Yeah. And for somebody who is passionate about getting into the line of work that you're in, is there any small tidbit of advice that you could give? Like, what would you do if you were starting out and only had so much money, but really wanted to get involved in doing wildlife photography or videography or storytelling?
Well, I would say, back to this idea of pick something, pick something because it will focus your attention. Right. And so let's say that you pick something like, something that's around your house. It needs to be close to you because the last thing you want to do is have to fly halfway around the world to try and get these photos. So it needs to be close. So let's just say like you pick the American robin, for example, right? Then start doing all of your homework that you can about finding every single picture of the American robin that's ever been taken, right? And start looking through those to see what's been done already, and start sourcing a little bit of inspiration about what you can do to make it differently. And then focus on taking pictures of the robin all the time. And you'll build up this body of work, and, eventually you'll be known as the robin guy. Right. And then all of a sudden you've got a career as the robin photographer.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, that's essentially what happened to me, with the mountain lion stuff. I picked mountain lions, started working on it, got really good at knowing their behavior, where they're going to go, how to set up cameras to photograph them, ended up working on a couple of films in a magazine. You know what I mean? So the specialization works for sure.
I also think what's, at least through my work that I've found, is you hear mountain lion versus American robin and you're like, oh God, obviously I'd rather do mountain lions. But the more and more you get into specific animals, the more and more you realize that each one of them has absolutely phenomenal behavior traits that are so unique to that specific species. I mean, I just think about my work with the feral cats in Hawaii and how obsessed with just seabird behavior I became, and how beautiful of a species they are, when a lot of times you might look at them and just think they look like seagulls. Right. You know what I mean? So I think that's a really interesting takeaway from what you said, but I think that's great advice. And then my last question is, if you could take a billboard out and put it on the side of the highway that disseminates one message in 10 words or less, this is a hard question. What would that be?
10 words or less.
Yeah, just basically what's one message that you think you wish you could spread into the world?
Well, man, I guess I would have to say, I don't know if I can count these letters out.
Well,
I mean, words out here.
If it's a few more words, it's not. We'll be.
I guess I would say the surest path to success is to never give up. You know what I mean? Don't quit. I wanted to be a photographer, and I made up my mind that was what I was going to do. And I didn't quit. And then all of a sudden I became a photographer. And so I think for people out there who are thinking about getting into this, at the hardest times when you're really struggling, don't quit, dig deep.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I mean, every overnight success that you ever see has 7 years of hard work behind them, or likely decades, even more. That's right. And I think that's something that's really lost in a lot of the understanding as to the work that goes in. I mean, look at most successful people. A lot of them who you might have started hearing about 6 months ago have been doing this work for 10, 20 years. So I think that's huge. Drew, thank you so much for taking the time. Like I said, I'm hugely thankful for you coming on the podcast. I'm a big fan and really looking forward to seeing what happens with these wolves over the next couple of months.
Right on. Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing the interviews with everybody else.
Yeah. And for everybody else listening, until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.